Welcome, friends, to another edition of Economic Reality Check, where we take a calm but critical look at how economics shapes our daily lives and how too often the stories we're told about policy success are little more than political theater dressed in fiscal jargon. I'm your host, and as always, I'm grateful you've joined me. Before jumping into today's topic, two quick notes. Next week, we'll release a special lecture on the age of subsidies, how governments buy time instead of change. And for those who follow our reading series, my latest essay, The Debt of Democracy, will be available online this weekend. Now let's turn to today's breaking story. $1. $2 billion in subsidies Canada pays to hold on, while Americans pay through housing prices. It's a tale of timber, tariffs, and unintended consequences. A story that begins in Canada's deep forests and ends in America's overheated housing market. Here's the headline in plain English. The Canadian government has announced a $1.2 billion support package for its lumber industry, an industry battered by U.S. tariffs and rising production costs. Ottawa calls it a stabilization measure. Washington calls it unfair assistance. But for most Canadians working in sawmills from British Columbia to Quebec, it's simply survival. At first glance, it sounds noble, a country defending its workers, shielding them from external pressure. But economics, real economics, rarely ends with the headline because just across the border in the United States, this Canadian support story quickly turns into something else, higher home prices for American families. Let's begin with the basics. Lumber is the backbone of North American housing. Roughly 80% of single-family homes in the U.S. are wood-framed. Canada supplies nearly one-third of that lumber. So when tariffs go up or when subsidies are used to absorb those tariffs, the ripple spreads fast. Ottawa's $1. $2 billion fund is designed to offset Washington's duties, which average about 15 to 20% depending on the classification. In other words, Canada is paying its own producers to endure America's tax wall. It's an economic stalemate disguised as patriotism. Canada pays to export, America pays to import. And both governments call it a victory for national interest. Now let's connect the dots. By shielding Canadian mills, Ottawa prevents mass layoffs, and that's the short-term goal. But the U.S. home building market, already squeezed by inflation and labor shortages, finds itself stuck with pricier lumber, scarcer supply, and little relief in sight. Builders in Arizona, Texas, and Florida are now forced to adjust. Many have shifted to steel frames or composite materials alternatives that carry their own costs and trade vulnerabilities. Take one fictional yet entirely plausible example. Phoenix Habitat Group, a mid-sized construction company in Arizona. In early 2024, it switched from wood to thin-gauge steel for new suburban housing tracts, a desperate bid to escape the lumber tariff trap. For a few months, it worked. Until, of course, a new round of U.S. tariffs on imported steel arrived, this time justified under national security grounds. Their savings vanished overnight. That's the paradox of trade wars. Every shield becomes someone else's spear. But let's pause here and ask a simple question. Who actually wins in this tug of war between tariff and subsidy? Not the Canadian worker, whose wages remain stagnant while mills consolidate. Not the American home buyer, whose mortgage now includes a hidden tax called trade friction. The winners, as usual, are a handful of conglomerates that can hedge, lobby, and survive the volatility. It's a familiar script, and not just for lumber. We've seen it with semiconductors, solar panels, even baby formula. Governments step in with billions, promising resilience, but end up preserving an inefficient status quo. Meanwhile, citizens paid twice, once as taxpayers funding the subsidies and again as consumers facing higher prices. So, as Canada writes billion-dollar checks to keep its forestry sector afloat, and as American builders scramble to adapt, one has to ask, is this economic policy or political pageantry designed to look tough while avoiding structural reform? Let's begin with a simple image. Picture two neighbors separated by a fence. One grows timber, the other builds homes. For decades, they traded freely, wood for dollars, dollars for prosperity. Then one day, each decides the other is cheating. The fence grows taller. Soon, both neighbors are shouting over the barrier, spending money to defend themselves from the trade that once enriched them both. That, in essence, is what has happened between Canada and the United States. The lumber dispute is older than most of the politicians currently shouting about it. It began in the early 1982 and has resurfaced 5 times since under every administration, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. Each round ends the same way: tariffs, countermeasures, and an uneasy truce financed by public funds. Ottawa calls them stabilization programs. Washington calls them enforcement of fair trade. Economists call them what they are: a tariff subsidy loop that neither side dares to end. Before jumping into numbers, let's remember the human side. In Canada's interior, in towns like Prince George, British Columbia, or Thunder Bay, Ontario, lumber isn't just an industry, it's an identity. Each round of tariffs has meant layoffs, bankruptcies, and lost generations of skilled work. When Ottawa steps in with subsidies, it isn't only buying wood, it's buying time, votes, and social calm. The C dollar 1.2 billion package announced this year keeps roughly 20,000 jobs indirectly alive, but it does not create new ones. It freezes a struggling system in place. Now, let's cross the border. In the US, that same tariff is sold as a patriotic measure protecting American mills. In reality, it protects inefficiency. The United States does produce lumber, but not nearly enough to meet housing demand, especially in the South and Southwest, where population growth has surged. Import restrictions make domestic producers richer, not stronger. And every extra dollar they earn comes directly from the pockets of American homebuyers. Here's what that means in practice. According to data from the National Association of Home Builders, lumber price increases in the last tariff round added roughly $14,000 to the cost of an average new U.S. home. That's before interest rates and inflation. In markets like Phoenix or Dallas, it's even higher. The irony is painful. Tariffs designed to help the American worker make it harder for those same workers to afford a home. Don't be fooled by the rhetoric of level playing fields. This isn't about fairness. It's about fear. Fear of global competition, fear of foreign control, fear of being seen as weak on trade. Both governments play that card. And in doing so, they turn public money into political theater. It's the same playbook we've seen across sectors. Washington launches tariffs to look tough. Ottawa launches subsidies to look protective. Each claims to defend the middle class, yet both fuel inflation and inequality. Every new policy comes with a press release, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a televised promise that this time will be different. It never is. Now consider the larger context. North America once imagined itself as a continental market, integrated, efficient, and mutually beneficial. That was the spirit behind the original NAFTA in 1994. But the return of tariffs and the rise of economic nationalism have turned that vision into a patchwork of suspicion. The lumber conflict is not an isolated case. It's a symptom of a deeper unraveling of trust between partners who used to speak the same economic language. Let's not forget, trade disputes rarely end with one side winning. They end when both sides run out of money or patience. The $1.2 billion subsidy is not a solution, it's a delay, a way to avoid confronting the real issue. Why does an integrated market still behave like rival kingdoms? The answer lies not in trade law, but in political economy. Governments find it easier to distribute cash than to challenge corporate power. Subsidies soothe voters. Tariffs excite them. And both distract from the structural reform neither side wants to touch. By the way, we should notice one more paradox. The same American politicians who attack Canadian unfair subsidies are the ones championing the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act, a domestic subsidy machine worth hundreds of billions. When it's Washington spending money to support its own industries, it's strategic investment. When Ottawa does the same, it's distortionary. That's not economics. That's hypocrisy wrapped in nationalism. So here we are, a continent locked in a loop. Canada pays to export, America pays to import, corporations pocket the margin, and ordinary citizens foot the bill through taxes and mortgage payments. This is called efficiency in the make-believe world of Washington, D.C. and Ottawa alike. Let's begin with a fact too few Americans want to face. Every time a government raises tariffs, it creates a new form of tax not paid at the border, but embedded in everyday life. Economists call it a pass-through cost. Builders feel it first, homeowners feel it next, and soon the entire economy carries it like a silent surcharge. In the case of lumber, that surcharge has quietly reshaped the U.S. housing market. Lumber prices are volatile even in normal times, but tariffs have turned volatility into structural inflation. When Washington taxes Canadian softwood, it's not foreign producers who they pass the cost on. The U.S. home builder becomes the next in line, and from there it cascades. Framers, developers, realtors, mortgage lenders. By the time a family signs for a new home, the border tax has become a 30-year mortgage burden. Before jumping into numbers, let's picture what this means on the ground. Imagine a young couple in Austin or Phoenix, both cities, that grew rapidly during the pandemic. They saved for years hoping to buy their first home. They finally qualify for a mortgage, only to discover that construction costs have risen by tens of thousands of dollars, not because wages went up, not because materials improved, but because two governments can't settle a 40-year dispute over lumber pricing formulas. That is the absurdity of modern protectionism. People are told they are being protected even as they are priced out of their futures. Now, the data, according to Bloomberg and the U.S. Census Bureau, and the median price of a new American home rose from $329,000 in 2019 to nearly $420,000 in 2024, an increase of over 25%. Part of that is interest rates, yes, but industry analysts estimate that material costs led by lumber contributed up to 1/5 of that increase. When you translate that into mortgage payments, it means American families are paying roughly $200 more per month for a house whose only improvement is an inflated supply chain. Don't be fooled by patriotic slogans about protecting American jobs. The truth is harsher. Tariffs have become a tool for redistributing income upward. They don't save industries, they consolidate them. The small mills in Oregon or Mississippi that were supposed to benefit often can't compete with giant corporate lumber conglomerates who can absorb the tariff noise and control market supply. Once again, protectionism protects the protected. Meanwhile, the Canadian government's subsidy package, that $1 $2 billion, is sold as a rescue for local workers, but in reality it functions as a public insurance policy for private exporters. The companies that dominate Canada's lumber trade, Canfor, West Fraser, Resolute, are multinational giants, not local cooperatives. Their shareholders are global. Their accountants are sophisticated, and they know how to turn subsidies into balance sheet armor. So both sides are playing the same game: public money for private stability. And in the middle, ordinary citizens are trapped in an economy that calls this market adjustment. Let's take our fictional case again, the Phoenix Habitat Group, that mid-sized construction company trying to navigate the chaos. After switching from wood to thin-gauge steel, their costs fell briefly until new tariffs on imported steel from South Korea and Vietnam erased the savings. Then, supply delays from the Pacific drove them to source recycled U.S. steel locally at prices nearly double what they paid abroad. Their final houses cost $60,000 more per unit, and the firm laid off 40 workers to stay solvent. The local newspaper praised them for innovating through adversity. They called it survival. Here's what that tells us: the more governments try to wall off their economies, the more those walls crumble inward. Supply chains don't vanish, they mutate. Builders, manufacturers, and consumers adapt, but the adaptation costs money. In the end, protectionism becomes self-harm disguised as self-reliance. Let's not forget that this isn't just about economics. It's about the moral economy of politics. Politicians claim tariffs will bring back jobs, yet the lumber and housing data show no surge in employment, just rising costs and deeper inequality. We live in a system that creates inefficiency, then subsidizes it, then asks the public to applaud the illusion of strength. By the way, when we talk about national security tariffs, as the U.S. now does for metals, we're entering the realm of absurd theater. Housing is not a weapon. 2x4s are not missiles, yet they're treated as if they were strategic assets. This inflationary patriotism turns every import into a potential threat, every subsidy into a moral crusade. So when Ottawa spends billions and Washington responds with more duties, the real effect isn't a stronger continent, it's a weaker middle class. Every new tariff, every temporary measure becomes a hidden tax on the dream of home ownership. And each time we pay it, we're told it's for our own protection. Now let's move outward from the forests of British Columbia and the suburbs of Phoenix to the wider map of global trade. Because while Canada and the United States argue over tariffs and subsidies, the rest of the world has been quietly adjusting, repositioning, and profiting from their dysfunction. What looks like a domestic dispute between two neighbors is in reality an open invitation to global competitors. Here's how that works. When the United States slaps tariffs on Canadian lumber, it doesn't make American wood magically appear. The market simply looks elsewhere. Imports from Europe, South America, and even Asia step in to fill the gap. Sweden, Brazil, and Chile have each increased exports of lumber and wood panels to the U.S. since the first Trump-era tariffs in 2017. The irony? Their environmental and labor standards are often lower than Canada's. In other words, Washington's policy, sold as a defense of fair trade, ends up rewarding producers who play by looser rules. Before jumping into the data, let's consider the Canadian perspective. Ottawa's $1.2 billion package isn't just about helping workers, It's about keeping the global customer, the United States, from walking away. But markets don't stand still. As U.S. demand becomes more erratic and tariffs more unpredictable, Canadian producers are looking westward across the Pacific toward Japan, South Korea, and increasingly Southeast Asia. Trade data already shows a shift. Canadian lumber exports to ASEAN nations have grown nearly 40% since 2020. What began as a defensive measure against American tariffs may now become a strategic reorientation of the entire industry. This is the unintended consequence of economic nationalism. It drives your friends into the arms of your competitors. Let's not forget, the U.S. housing market depends on steady, reliable supply. When that supply becomes politicized, volatility follows. Builders can't plan, prices swing, financing becomes riskier. The global market notices. Asian and European exporters price in that volatility and raise margins accordingly. They know American buyers have few choices left. So while politicians in Washington celebrate standing up to unfair trade, the world's lumber traders quietly thank them for the gift of scarcity. It's not just wood. The same dynamic is emerging in multiple sectors: steel, aluminum, even cement. Each round of protectionism fractures what was once a continental system into smaller opportunistic trade triangles. Canada, seeking stability, has signed a series of new supply agreements with Japan and Vietnam. Mexico, hit by separate U.S. duties, is courting Brazil and the EU. The result is that North America, once envisioned as an integrated economic bloc under NAFTA, and now the USMCA is fragmenting into what some economists call micro blocks. Each country subsidizes itself, tariffs its neighbor, and signs side deals across oceans to offset the damage. And this has a political cost. Every subsidy that ties Canada closer to Asia loosens its dependency on the U.S. market. Every new import contract from Brazil or Sweden erodes America's claim to continental self-sufficiency. We are witnessing a slow but steady unwinding of a 30-year project, the dream that North America could function as a coherent economic region. That dream is fading into a patchwork of tariffs, lawsuits, and press conferences. Let's pause here to see the irony. Washington's trade hawks often accuse China of weaponizing supply chains, using subsidies and export controls to gain leverage. Yet the US and Canada are doing precisely the same thing to each other. The difference is they call it defending sovereignty. It shows how far political rhetoric has drifted from economic reason. When your best customer becomes your adversary, you don't win autonomy. You lose efficiency, stability, and credibility. By the way, this shift has already caught the attention of Canada's western provinces. British Columbia's forestry ministry has openly discussed diversifying away from the U.S. market. And that's not anti-American sentiment, it's self-preservation. When one neighbor keeps moving the goalposts, you eventually build another field. Here's what that tells us. The tariff subsidy cycle doesn't just distort prices. It reshapes alliances. The $1.2 billion package that was meant to protect Canada's lumber jobs may, over time, push them eastward toward global markets, less politically volatile, even if less profitable. Meanwhile, the U.S., in isolating itself, becomes a more expensive place to build, invest, and live. We need to remember that global markets operate on trust. Tariffs erode it. Subsidies only patch it temporarily. Every dollar spent defending an artificial trade wall is a dollar not spent improving productivity, technology, or sustainability. Instead of investing in better forestry practices, both governments invest in bureaucracy and rhetoric. It's not progress, it's paralysis. And so the logic circles back. Canada pays to stay afloat. The US pays through inflated housing. The world adjusts and earns the profit. It's a slow leak of competitiveness disguised as patriotism. In the long run, that's the real price of this so-called economic sovereignty. Let's begin with the people who never appear in the press releases. The mill worker in Prince George, who's seen 3 rounds of layoffs in 6 years. The contractor in Phoenix, who now quotes projects 30% higher because material costs keep changing by the week. The young family in Ohio or Alberta that no longer asks when they can buy a house, but if they ever will. These are not abstract economic indicators. They are the casualties of a trade war fought in spreadsheets and campaign slogans. Before diving into the analysis, it's worth pausing to note something deeply human. Economies are built on expectations, the faith that tomorrow's effort will mean something. But in towns dependent on lumber, that faith has been eroding for decades. Tariffs come and go. Subsidies rise and fall. What remains constant is insecurity. Workers are told to hang in there, that the government has their back. Yet they know, as most working people eventually learn, that these billion-dollar rescue packages rarely reach the factory floor. In 2025, the average hourly wage in Canada's forestry sector stands at just over $29 per hour, barely above inflation-adjusted levels from a decade ago. Mill closures in rural British Columbia have forced families to relocate while others take on seasonal work in construction or trucking. Ottawa's $1 $2 billion subsidy may keep the lights on at corporate headquarters, but for many workers, it's a flickering bulb, not a sunrise. On the American side, the rhetoric flips, but the outcome is the same. Builders and laborers are told tariffs protect American jobs, yet in practice, they see projects delayed, budgets cut, and paychecks squeezed. According to the Associated General Contractors of America, nearly 30% of U.S. residential construction firms have had to lay off workers or reduce hours due to rising material costs since 2023. That is the hidden labor tax of protectionism, fewer hours, thinner margins, and the constant anxiety of uncertainty. Let's not forget, every tariff is a redistribution. Money moves from the many to the few. Home buyers pay more so that a handful of domestic producers can claim to be competitive. Governments spend billions to save jobs that global automation and consolidation will eliminate anyway. It's economic triage, not reform. And the public is asked to applaud the performance, mistaking survival for progress. Now imagine what that looks like on a street level. In rural Canada, once busy mill towns have turned into semi-permanent ghost communities. Schools close. Local diners disappear. Young people leave, chasing work in cities that no longer build much of anything. In the American Southwest, housing contractors cycle through materials, wood, steel, composites like gamblers, switching tables, hoping for one more lucky hand before the tariffs change again. And across the border, bureaucrats draft new frameworks for dispute resolution that everyone knows will fail the next time politics heats up. Don't be fooled by the headlines celebrating resilience. What we're witnessing is managed decline. A continent that once built a shared middle class now maintains it through subsidies and slogans. Workers on both sides are being asked to believe that national pride can replace stable livelihoods. It cannot. By the way, this pattern isn't unique to North America. It's the same story that played out in the Rust Belt during the 1,980 seconds in British coal towns after Thatcher's privatizations and in Southern Europe during the austerity era. Governments claim to defend domestic industry, but what they really defend is the illusion of control, a narrative of strength that masks economic retreat. Let's consider again our fictional case, Phoenix Habitat Group. Its workforce was once 200 strong. Today it's 120. The company survives, but barely. The CEO admits they now spend more time reading trade bulletins than designing houses. Their project managers have become amateur economists forecasting tariff changes before they can bid a contract. We used to build homes, one foreman says. Now we build spreadsheets. That sentence captures the quiet despair of a generation caught between political posturing and market reality. Here's what that tells us. Protectionism doesn't rebuild communities. It hollows them out and then paints the emptiness with flags. And yet, in both countries, public opinion polls still show majority support for tariffs and subsidies. Why? Because people are afraid. They've seen globalization fail them, corporations abandon them, and governments ignore them. Tariffs feel like justice, a punishment for someone else, anyone else. But as history reminds us, revenge is rarely profitable. Economic nationalism satisfies the heart and starves the home. Let's not forget the paradox we now live in. Workers are told they're fighting foreign competition when in fact they're competing against their own government's policies. That's not strategy, that's sabotage dressed as solidarity. Let's begin with a question that should make every citizen uneasy. When did economic policy become a branch of emotional management? When did trade, once a technical domain of tariffs, quotas, and cost curves, turn into a theater of pride, grievance, and symbolic revenge? The answer lies in a single word, fear. Fear sells. Fear mobilizes. And in the age of economic insecurity, fear has replaced analysis as the currency of politics. Before we go deeper, let's remember something essential. Both Canada and the United States are democracies that know how to speak the language of economics, but increasingly choose the grammar of emotion. In Ottawa, leaders invoke the Canadian worker as a national hero under siege. In Washington, candidates warn of foreign predators stealing American jobs. The result? The public stops asking hard questions about productivity, corporate tax loopholes, or the cost of living and starts cheering for team colors. Buy American, defend Canadian industry. The slogans sound noble, but they function like comfort food, emotionally satisfying, nutritionally empty. Behind them lies a politics of substitution. Replace real reform with moral spectacle. Politicians no longer need to fix the system. They just need to find a foreign scapegoat for its failures. Let's take an example. In 2018, when former President Trump launched tariffs on steel, aluminum, and Canadian lumber, his approval ratings among working class voters briefly spiked. He promised those tariffs would bring back jobs long lost to automation and consolidation. They didn't, but politically it didn't matter. The tariffs weren't about economics, they were about identity. They transformed insecurity into belonging. We're fighting back, he said, and millions believed him, even as they paid more for cars, appliances, and homes. By the way, this isn't unique to Trump. Every administration since Reagan has played this game in some form. Democrats wrap it in the language of fair trade. Republicans brand it as economic sovereignty. Both appeal to patriotism while quietly serving the same corporate donors. The tragedy is that the rhetoric works. It provides a sense of purpose in a system that has stopped delivering stability. In Canada, the tone is softer but no less emotional. When Ottawa announced the $C won 2 billion subsidy, the language was deliberately martial, defending jobs, protecting communities, standing firm against unfair US practices. Yet, behind the speeches, the government was also protecting powerful lumber lobbies with deep political connections. Fear once again becomes a veil for favoritism. Let's not forget, nationalism in economics is not new. In the 1930 seconds, protectionism helped deepen the Great Depression. Countries closed their borders to save domestic industry and ended up shrinking global trade by nearly 70%. Back then, fear of losing sovereignty justified every barrier. Today, the vocabulary is more sophisticated: supply chain resilience, strategic autonomy, de-risking, but the logic is identical. The world shrinks, cooperation weakens, and citizens bear the cost in silence. Now, let's return to the social psychology of it. For millions of working people, the economy has become an unpredictable machine, one they no longer control or understand. Jobs vanish, prices rise, politicians talk about market adjustments. It's only natural that people look for a moral framework to make sense of it. Nationalism provides that framework. It turns complex global systems into simple moral stories: us versus them, victims versus villains. Don't be fooled. This simplicity is the point. It prevents people from asking who really benefits, because behind every tariff and subsidy is a corporation lobbying for its slice of the pie. Behind every populist speech about foreign enemies is a campaign donor expecting a favor. The language of patriotism becomes the soundtrack to an elaborate economic transfer from taxpayers to boardrooms, from workers to shareholders. Here's what that means for the lumber dispute. Canadians are told their subsidies are an act of courage. Americans are told their tariffs are an act of justice. Both narratives depend on the same emotional architecture: fear of losing control in a world that feels too big. It's a powerful illusion and an expensive one. And yet, the alternative, genuine cooperation, is treated as weakness. When economists suggest negotiating a long-term resource pact, they're dismissed as globalists. When labor unions advocate for cross-border solidarity, they're labeled naive. In a media landscape built on outrage, reasoned compromise doesn't trend, fear does. By the way, we should be clear: nationalism is not inherently evil. Love of one's country can inspire service, responsibility, and pride. But when it's used as a substitute for policy, when it becomes a shield against accountability, it turns toxic. It blinds us to the simple truth that the challenges of our age, climate change, automation, housing, inequality, don't stop at customs checkpoints. They demand cooperation, not competition disguised as defense. Here's the paradox: the more politicians weaponize patriotism to manage economic anxiety, the weaker both democracies become. The public grows cynical, trust erodes, and the line between public interest and political marketing dissolves completely.